I'm Adrian Scott Fine. I'm with the Los Angeles Conservancy. I'll be talking about 1950s to 70s downtown commercial revitalization. To start with some context, during the 1950s through the mid to late 1970s, a new era emerged across the U.S., really centered on bold experimental ideas for, quote, saving cities in the midst of an urban crisis by designing new forms of commerce, competing with suburbia through attempts to create an equal playing field, and honestly, fundamentally embracing survival through city planning. Blight, slum clearance, and redeveloping large-scale urban areas, and sometimes entire central business districts in both small, mid-sized, and large cities ramped up to become the norm as redevelopment interventions scaled up and boasted grand expectations to address both an urban crisis and a social revolution. Universally, there was a desire to fix our cities. When urban areas were routinely referred to as sick and dying, a consensus was developing on how to, quote, arrest the decay of our cities and control the suburban growth recklessly consuming land. Here you see a 1962 nationwide contest endorsed by the U.S. Housing and Finance Agency, stating one of the greatest challenges of the times is this vital need to deal with blighted parts of our cities under this motto, improved human environment through urban renewal. Cities all over approach urban renewal in different ways. Here we have Bangor, Maine and their urban renewal story, laying out their basic facts, their choices, and that the solution to the problem is urban renewal, and Dick and Jane understanding how serious of a condition it actually is. And the solution? A Bangor downtown urban renewal plan. Cities were both in a race with time and a race with race, as the civil rights movement was born alongside this desire to boldly remake and redefine urban places, where white flight largely left a segregated community without representation, resources, and the concentration of poverty, at the time prompting many to equate these interventions and renewal as thinly veiled attempts at, quote, Negro removal. I'm guessing most of you think you already know the story of urban renewal as a story from the mid-20th century as a federal funding program that was initiated and rooted in the 1949 and 1954 Housing Acts and officially ended as a policy in 1974 that set out to strategically intervene and solve the problems of struggling inner cities, often using demolition as the answer. In raising hundreds of thousands of buildings and entire neighborhoods and acres of downtowns, urban renewal epitomizes government's power to alter a community's physical, social, racial, and economic fabric. More often than not, this era is portrayed as a saga and tale of morality, dismal mixed results, controversy, and a failure rather than a happy ending. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing on the commercial side of downtown revitalization during this era through an urban renewal lens, mainly efforts to upend the traditional shopping experience through pedestrian malls and other innovations of this time period. Urban renewal from the 1950s to the 1970s was no surprise largely wrapped up and packaged in all things having to do with modernism. In many ways, it really was the perfect fit for everything urban renewal and commercial revitalization efforts espoused to do at the time. It's all about contrasts, innovative and experimental ideas attempting to fix a problem, bold expressions, and charting a new course, even if the idea and concept often was not fully backed up in execution and may have failed. Today, many do not appreciate or fully understand these places, despite living with them for more than 50 years. Fresno, California speaks to this. Few tout the merits or success of a 1964 pedestrian mall. Certainly not the Fulton Mall, one of which is now destroyed given the politics that were stacked against its survival. While some might argue it's counterintuitive, or at the very least ironic, to now want to preserve some of these places that people once fought against, it is an important and long overdue moment in how we think about and judge a class of buildings and places. It is what I refer to as the men in suits pointing at models era, espousing have we vision, have we great plans, all very much in survival mode and all about trying to save their dying cities. It's about having a project that's large enough to have an impact, but small enough to have some immediate success. To better understand urban renewal and the modern movement of the 1950s through the 70s, you honestly have to go back to its roots from the 1930s that led up to this idea of constantly modernizing commercial environments to both retain, compete, and attract business. In the "if you build it, they will come" mentality, the U.S. has a long history of industry hyping and marketing commercial storefront makeovers as the way to ensure relevancy and profitability. In this case, a 1935 campaign to encourage business owners to modernize their storefronts. It stems from product manufacturers sponsoring Main Street contests to civic groups rallying to create a look that competes with an emerging modernist and suburban aesthetic. Like urban renewal's linkage with the federal government's financial assistance, the passage of New Deal legislation in 1935 helped introduce incentives for small business owners to undertake modern storefront renovations, using the slogan, "Modernize Main Street." Simply put, the idea was that there's both jobs and money to be had and a better economy through modernization. What emerged from this is a modernist aesthetic, with large plate glass windows, aluminum, open front, angled and asymmetrical storefronts, the whole idea of integrated signage and flat, smooth surfaces, all within a modern realm. And it was all this idea of the open vision, lots of glass, and what they called, or at least product manufacturers at the time called, a silent salesman in drawing people in to spend money. Before the idea of demolition and clearance fully took hold through urban renewal, it really started in many ways through the intervention of making what's old look new by covering up the old through architectural slipcovers, or what happened in my own hometown where I grew up in the Midwest, this idea of if this is what you have, old buildings, this is what you want, new buildings. By the 1960s, it was facades and wall systems and slipcovers that completely covered old facades with superimposed wall signage, catering more really to automobiles rather than pedestrians, and you see this happening in downtowns all over like a domino effect, one by one buildings going this direction. As you can see in these two examples, one certainly more extreme than the other, it really was a hit and miss in terms of how successful these approaches actually were. The design was in direct response and competing with strip centers and emerging malls that provided a simple graphic identity and enclosure and marketing around a grouping of stores, all the while offering ample parking and one-stop shopping.
However, all is not lost. In recent months, a green and glowing ray of hope has appeared to brighten the streets of our cities. A surprisingly large number of enterprising communities have taken steps to reclaim downtown areas for the lowly pedestrian. They call these bits of hard-won greenery malls. Burbank's new Golden Mall is one of the latest. It will bring to the citizens of Burbank the modern-day equivalent of the old village green. Today, the pedestrian strikes back. A report on mall fever, the new trend in city planning.
Suburbanization and the convenience of a one-stop mall shopping experience prompted the pedestrian mall, where civic leaders closed existing downtown streets to automobile traffic and transformed them into a car-free pedestrian oasis, very much akin to a mall-like environment, though outdoors. Pedestrian malls were born out of the same era as urban renewal, sometimes as a standalone development and self-funded assessment districts, or as part of a larger CBD master plan effort directly funded in whole or in part through urban renewal. By 1959, over 700 American cities had published downtown revitalization and urban renewal funded plans. During this era, downtown retail sales rapidly declined, dropping 15%, creating a domino effect with pockets of vacancy, abandoned buildings, reduced tax base, and vandalism. More and more cities were eyeing the pedestrian shopping mall as a device to help bring the customer back downtown and compete with popular suburban alternatives. Here's an example from Mountain View, California. Suburban shopping experience, however outdoor, from 1957. As you'll see, it includes a lot of the features that were to be later found on pedestrian malls across the U.S.
In contrast, Fresno, California's Fulton Mall is designed for maximum human participation and convenience. Riverside's mall is also an active place where almost anything interesting to people can be seen. An exhibit of livestock from nearby farms, or a fashion show sponsored by local merchants. Strictly homey touches, but such activities nevertheless bring people together, and that's a plus.
Pulling off the pedestrian mall was a much bigger idea requiring site, transportation, and large-scale infrastructure planning. Between 1959 and 1980, more than 200 cities invested and banked on the pedestrian mall as a savior for downtown, essentially grounded in the assumption that remaking their downtown to mimic suburban shopping centers would stimulate and revitalize the downtown retail. The majority of pedestrian malls were introduced in small to mid-sized cities, though they were in large cities as well. Perhaps the earliest example here dates to 1958 when Springfield, Oregon embarked on a 10-day trial experiment, what we would call today a pop-up. It was a shopper's paradise experiment, rerouting 10,000 cars. The street was temporarily blocked off, landscape, benches installed, there were art exhibits, and in this case, however, it was never made permanent. Kalamazoo, Michigan is credited as the first official permanent pedestrian mall in the U.S. Starting in 1959, designed by planner and architect Victor Gruen. As inventor and father of the modern shopping mall, he was also the primary advocate for outdoor pedestrian malls. Gruen's philosophy was to bring the shopping experience where you walk and meet people, and central to this idea of a sociable street was to tame the automobile by creating downtown pedestrian malls. He envisioned Kalamazoo Pedestrian Mall as a tri-part interrelated system, including a ring road to circle the central business district and parking lots to be constructed just outside. Only the pedestrian mall was ever built, the rest was never realized. The Kalamazoo Pedestrian Mall was initially confined to 2 city blocks. A year later, 2 additional blocks were added. Gruen argued that good design equaled good profits, so you'll find in pedestrian malls hallmark features including brick paving, public art, piped-in music, fountains, benches, trees, playgrounds. Other pedestrian malls featured skating rinks, super graphic murals, stages for performances, and in this particular case, shuttles for shoppers. While Gruen's influence was widespread, not every city did a pedestrian mall, but those that did grabbed onto it out of desperation. In 1972, the city of Boston surveyed 8 cities with established pedestrian malls to determine if it would work for their central business district, looking at 25 different considerations. From this study, 7 out of the 8 cities reported that it spurred much investment after it was opening, the malls. 6 of the 8 malls reported large increases in retail sales immediately following the mall's construction. Mall costs ranged from $114,000 in Kalamazoo to almost $4 million in Minneapolis. They ranged in size from 3 to 9 blocks. Construction ranged from anywhere as short as 3 months to up to a year and a half. By the 1970s, pedestrianization was a core focus of city planning. California, for instance, in 1960 established a standalone pedestrian mall law. As a state, it likely produced the highest concentration of pedestrian malls throughout the United States. Back to Fresno, California, in 1964, Victor Gruen Associates created a 6-block, 7.6-acre pedestrian mall as part of a larger urban renewal master plan to revitalize the central business district. This involved re-envisioning an 18-block area into a new core superblock. Gruen partnered with noted landscape architect Ekbo, Dean, and Williams to create a pedestrian mall featuring several fountains, pools, mature trees, vine-covered pergolas, sitting areas, 2 play areas, lighting and sound system, and over 30 locations for modernist sculpture. Fresno's Fulton Mall is considered the country's finest, most realized pedestrian mall, resulting directly from urban renewal. According to Gruen at the time, Fresno set new standards for urban renewal and became a nationwide model for other cities to emulate. By 1974, pedestrian mall activity and construction really had reached its peak. Initially, many of the pedestrian malls did succeed, increasing sales and halting retail decline, but it wasn't something that could be sustained over time. By the early to mid-1980s, the vast majority of them were failing, with deteriorated infrastructure, high vacancies, low rents, and generally there were places in the city that you tended to try to avoid. So what's the legacy here? With some rare exceptions, one by one, they started to disappear, and pedestrian malls were no longer, and streets were reopened to cars. Ironically, many were removed for the very reason they were initially created, to save and revitalize downtown. On average, most lasted no more than 25 years. Only about 10% of the original pedestrian malls remain today. In Kalamazoo, the original pedestrian mall in the United States, was partially open to cars in 1998. By 2013, the buildings in Fresno's Fulton Mall were 56% vacant. In 2016, Fresno's Fulton Mall was no longer, removed just as it was created using federal funding, just like its origin through urban renewal, in this case a different source of funding. It followed a protracted, multi-year, highly controversial community debate, those that sided that wanted to keep it and those that wanted to remove it to induce revitalization of downtown Fresno. Prior to its destruction, in 2010, the Fulton Mall was formally determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Only 2 other pedestrian malls have achieved this level of recognition. The Downtown Mall in Charlottesville, Virginia, designed by Lawrence Halprin, and Miami's Lincoln Road Mall, designed by Morris Lapidus.
Do you consider the mall a success?
Definitely, from the standpoint of enhancing the area, the mall is a tremendous success. We have a beautiful mall. We're setting a stage for the most beautiful promotion productions that you could possibly imagine right here in downtown Riverside.
Complaints against the mall are few and far between in downtown Riverside these days.
While there might not have been any complaints then, there certainly were those that were to come for communities that ultimately rejected the pedestrian malls. They initially came about from this: traffic congestion and this desire to separate people from an automobile and to create environments that would compete with their suburban counterparts. Now, more than 50 years later, following the undertaking of more than 2,100 urban renewal projects across the country and over 200 pedestrian malls, this era needs to be re-examined in the context of history, planning, preservation, and modernism. The idea of saving urban renewal, let alone products like pedestrian malls, is a loaded and not so easy concept to quantify for what this era represents to those who experienced it, lived through it, and inherited it and its legacy, both the good and the bad parts. Sorting out the backlash against and ultimate rejection of things like pedestrian malls during this time is complex, especially in connection with urban renewal. We need to sift through the rhetoric and determine on a case-by-case basis what's worth keeping and also what's worth losing from urban renewal's remaining built environment, dare I say, heritage. In the absence of a national debate or even a consensus about what to do with these places, or any conversation, we are getting mixed results, much like the urban renewal program itself, quietly going away without any question or discussion about its future and its legacy. Thank you.